In rural Deadwood, South Dakota, a 68-year-old retired accountant was about to experience the most painful betrayal of her life. What began as a simple family gathering erupted into heartbreak when her daughter declared she contributed nothing to the family. Eleanor McKinnon was no ordinary grandmother. For 35 years, she had built a reputation as the financial wizard who helped countless local businesses survive economic downturns, all while raising her children alone after her husband's early death. When confronted with her daughter's cruel dismissal, she had no idea she was walking into a calculated scheme. Eleanor's dignified response would trigger a complete transformation of her family dynamics. What started as unconditional love would evolve into a powerful lesson about self-respect that would forever change the close-knit community of Deadwood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The April sunshine streamed through Eleanor McKinnon's kitchen window, casting long golden rectangles across her worn oak table. Her arthritic fingers moved with practiced precision as she arranged fresh-cut wildflowers in her mother's crystal vase, the centerpiece for today's family lunch. Though her joints protested with each careful movement, Eleanor refused to let physical discomfort interfere with the monthly tradition she'd maintained for over 20 years. Just a bit more water, she murmured to herself, adjusting the blooms. With the same meticulous attention she'd once given to balancing the books for half the businesses in Deadwood. The familiar scent of her signature beef stew filled the modest farmhouse kitchen, a recipe she'd perfected during the lean years after Thomas died, when stretching $1 meant the difference between keeping their small acreage and losing everything. Eleanor glanced at the clock, 11:30. Rebecca would arrive soon with her husband Craig and their children. Her daughter had always been punctual, a trait Eleanor had instilled in her from childhood, along with the importance of financial prudence and planning for the future. Values that had seemed to take root until recently. The dining room table was already set with Eleanor's best dishes, not expensive china, but sturdy stoneware she and Thomas had received as wedding gifts 46 years ago. Each plate represented a memory, each glass a story from a life built on careful saving and occasional modest indulgence. The silverware gleamed in the sunlight, polished that morning despite the way her wrists ached afterward. From the kitchen, the timer chimed softly. Eleanor moved to check on her fresh-baked bread, inhaling the comforting aroma as she tested it with a gentle tap. Perfect. Just as she was placing the golden loaf on a cutting board, she heard tires on the gravel driveway. Right on time, she said to herself, smoothing down her best blouse, a simple blue cotton piece she'd bought last season during the clearance sale at Mitchell's department store. Rebecca had commented once that the color brought out Eleanor's eyes, and though such compliments had grown rare in recent years, the memory still warmed her. The sound of car doors slamming was followed by the familiar pattern of footsteps on the porch. Eleanor arranged her features into a welcoming smile as the door opened without a knock, a small thing that always bothered her, the gradual erosion of little courtesies that had once been automatic. Grandma. 12-year-old Sophie rushed in first, her gangly limbs and bright smile a welcome contrast to the strained expressions that typically accompanied the adults these days. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said, embracing her granddaughter with genuine delight. "How's my little mathematician doing?" "I got an A on my probability test," Sophie announced proudly. "I used those tricks you taught me about fractions." "That's wonderful." Eleanor beamed. "I always said you had a head for numbers." Behind Sophie came 16-year-old Jason, his attention fixed firmly on his phone, offering only a mumbled, "Hey, Grandma," without looking up. Eleanor noticed his new sneakers, expensive ones she'd seen advertised in the sporting goods store window downtown. The kind that cost more than she'd spent on an entire month's groceries. Rebecca and Craig followed, their entrance bringing a subtle shift to the atmosphere. Rebecca, once so much like Eleanor in her practical outlook, now wore designer jeans and carried what Eleanor recognized as an expensive handbag, the same brand she'd seen in the magazines Sophie sometimes left behind. Craig's customary scowl seemed deeper today, his eyes darting around the farmhouse as if cataloging its deficiencies. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that particular tone that Eleanor had learned to recognize, part obligation, part impatience. "Sorry we're a few minutes late. Traffic on Main Street was backed up with tourists." Eleanor nodded, though they both knew Main Street in Deadwood rarely experienced anything that could genuinely be called traffic, especially in April before the summer tourist season began in earnest. "It's no problem at all," Eleanor replied. "The stew is ready, and I've just taken the bread out of the oven." Craig made a show of checking his watch. "We can't stay too long. I've got a conference call at 3. "On a Saturday?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. "Some of us work weekends when necessary," Craig replied, the edge in his voice unmistakable. The resort development doesn't schedule itself around family lunches. Eleanor absorbed the barb silently. Craig's real estate development company had been expanding rapidly over the past few years, building luxury vacation homes that most local residents could never afford. She'd offered financial advice when they'd started the business counsel born from decades of helping small businesses weather economic uncertainties, but her suggestions about sustainable growth and manageable debt had been increasingly unwelcome. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let's eat while everything's hot, Eleanor said instead, directing them toward the dining room where steam rose invitingly from the tureen of stew. As they settled around the table, Eleanor noticed Rebecca eyeing the wildflower centerpiece with barely disguised disapproval. "Those are interesting," Rebecca said, her tone making clear that interesting wasn't a compliment. "You know, Mom, Bloom and Petal Downtown has some lovely spring arrangements. I could pick one up for you sometime." "These are black-eyed Susans and prairie comeflowers from the south pasture," Eleanor explained. "Your father always said wildflowers had more character than store-bought ones." Rebecca's smile tightened. "Dad's been gone for 20 years, Mom. Sometimes it's okay to update things." The comment stung more than it should have. Thomas had been gone for 22 years, actually, a fact that Rebecca, who had been only 18 when her father died of a sudden heart attack, should have remembered. Eleanor began serving the stew, her movements deliberate despite the slight tremor in her hands that had become more noticeable lately. "How is the resort project coming along?" she asked, an olive branch extended across the growing divide. "We're behind schedule," Craig answered curtly. "Contractors in this area don't understand the concept of deadlines. And the banks are being difficult about the next phase of financing." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. The First National has always been conservative with development loans. When the Miller property was being converted to that bed and breakfast back in '98, I had to practically camp in Stanley Wilson's office to get them to see the potential. Craig's expression hardened. "This is a bit different from a small-town B&B, Eleanor. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar luxury resort development." Of course, Eleanor conceded, recognizing the familiar dismissal of her experience. "I just meant that local banks often need extra convincing when it comes to larger projects. What we need is investors who understand the vision," Rebecca interjected, spooning stew into her bowl with visible reluctance. "Not more lectures about fiscal responsibility." Another barb that found its mark. Eleanor focused on helping Sophie with her bread, pretending not to notice how Rebecca picked at her food, taking tiny bites and leaving most of it untouched. "This stew is a little bland, Mom," Rebecca finally said. "Maybe try some of those gourmet spice blends next time? There's a wonderful shop in Rapid City." "I like it, Grandma," Sophie offered loyally. "It tastes like always." "That's exactly the problem," Craig muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Everything here always tastes, looks, and feels exactly the same. Like time stopped in 1995. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I'll remember that for next time." The conversation limped along through lunch. Rebecca talked about their upcoming vacation to Scottsdale, describing the exclusive resort and spa packages with enthusiasm that felt deliberately pointed. Jason occasionally looked up from his phone to request that something be passed to him. Sophie chatted about school and her math club competitions, the only genuine engagement at the table. "Grandma, will you come to the regional finals next month?" Sophie asked hopefully. "We're competing against schools from 3 states, and Coach says I might get to do the lightning round." Before Eleanor could answer, Rebecca cut in. "Mom's probably too busy with her garden and her book club, honey. And it's a 3-hour drive to Sioux Falls." "I would love to come," Eleanor said firmly, looking directly at her granddaughter. "Just give me the date, and I'll be there with bells on." Sophie beamed, but Rebecca's expression darkened. "We'll see." The schedule's still tentative. As Eleanor brought out her blackberry cobbler for dessert, made with berries she'd picked and frozen last summer, Craig's phone rang. He answered immediately, stepping away from the table without excusing himself. Eleanor caught phrases like insufficient collateral and alternative financing options before he moved out of earshot. Rebecca watched her husband with obvious concern before turning back to Eleanor. "Mom, the house is looking a bit run down. When was the last time you had someone check the roof? Those shingles on the north side are curling." "I had Bill Jackson take a look last fall," Eleanor replied. "He said they'd be fine for another year or 2. "Bill Jackson is nearly as old as you are," Rebecca scoffed. "You need a professional inspection, not a retiree with a ladder." "Bill worked construction for 40 years, Eleanor reminded her. "He knows what he's looking at." Rebecca sighed dramatically. "This place is becoming a money pit." The roof, the outdated kitchen, that ancient furnace, have you thought about downsizing? There are some really nice senior apartments in Rapid City. The suggestion hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The farmhouse had been her home for 45 years. She and Thomas had saved for 7 years to make the down payment, had celebrated every milestone within these walls, had weathered financial storms and personal tragedies under this roof. I'm perfectly comfortable here, she said carefully. And I can manage the maintenance just fine. Can you? Rebecca's tone sharpened. The garden's half the size it used to be, the back porch is sagging, and frankly, Mom, you're not getting any younger. None of us are, Eleanor replied, struggling to keep her voice even. But I'm still quite capable of looking after myself and my property. Craig returned to the table, his expression thunderous. That was the bank, he announced without preamble. They're requesting additional guarantees for the construction loan. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Rebecca turned to her husband, her voice tight with anxiety. What kind of guarantees? The kind we don't have, Craig snapped. Not without bringing in another partner, which would dilute our stake. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke carefully. If it's a question of short-term capital requirements, perhaps I could. No, Craig cut her off sharply. We don't need financial advice from someone who still balances her checkbook by hand and thinks investing in CDs is the height of financial strategy. The room fell silent. Even Jason looked up from his phone, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Craig, Rebecca said, but her tone held warning rather than reproof. What? Craig challenged. We've been dancing around this for months. Your mother lives in the financial dark ages. The world has moved on from her penny-pinching, risk-averse mindset. Eleanor set down her dessert spoon with deliberate care. I understand that financial approaches change over time, but certain principles remain constant. Over-leveraging in a volatile market, see? Craig interrupted, gesturing toward Eleanor as if she'd just proven his point. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Outdated thinking from someone who's never managed anything more complex than household accounts and small-town business ledgers. That's not fair, Sophie protested, her young face flushed with indignation. Grandma helped lots of businesses. She tells me about it all the time. Honey, that was a different era, Rebecca said dismissively. Before digital banking and global markets. Before real investment opportunities. Eleanor looked at her daughter, truly looked at her, and felt a strange sense of disconnect. When had Rebecca become this person who measured worth solely by financial daring and material acquisition? Who dismissed decades of hard-won wisdom as irrelevant? Who seemed increasingly embarrassed by the modest, practical values that had sustained their family through genuine hardship? I think, Eleanor said quietly, that there's value in experience, regardless of the era it comes from. Rebecca set her napkin down with a finality that signaled the end of her patience. Mom, I'm going to be blunt because we're family. Your experience isn't relevant anymore. The world doesn't work the way it did when you were keeping books with a pencil and paper. Rebecca, Eleanor began, but her daughter wasn't finished. You live in this time capsule, Rebecca continued, gesturing around the farmhouse, clinging to outdated ideas and refusing to adapt. And then you wonder why we don't come to you for advice. I don't recall offering unsolicited advice, Eleanor said, her voice growing quieter as her daughters grew louder. You don't have to say it. It's in every disapproving look when we talk about the resort project. Every comment about fiscal responsibility and sustainable growth. As if we're children who don't understand basic business principles. Craig leaned forward, his expression a mixture of frustration and condescension. Eleanor, the truth is, your financial opinions aren't valuable in today's market. You've never taken a real risk. Never leveraged assets for growth. Never understood the concept of speculative investment. Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow, but kept her expression neutral. Years of weathering financial crises with small business owners had taught her the importance of maintaining composure when emotions ran high. I see, she said simply. No, I don't think you do, Rebecca said, her voice rising. You sit here in judgment of our choices while contributing nothing to our success. Nothing to our future. You're just stuck in the past. The words, contributing nothing, echoed in the suddenly silent room. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. Jason finally put down his phone, looking uncomfortable. Even Craig seemed taken aback by the baldness of Rebecca's statement. Eleanor's hands, which had remained steady through financial crashes, her husband's death, and raising 2 children alone, now trembled visibly against the tablecloth. The cobbler sat forgotten as the weight of her daughter's assessment settled over the table like a shroud. I think, Eleanor said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, that you should leave now. Mom, Rebecca began, perhaps recognizing she'd crossed a line. Please. The single word carried enough quiet authority that Rebecca fell silent. I need some time to myself. Craig stood immediately, clearly relieved to have an excuse to depart. Jason followed suit, already reabsorbed in whatever was happening on his phone screen. Sophie remained seated, her young face troubled. Grandma. I didn't mean, it's not you, sweetheart, Eleanor assured her, managing a small smile. Sometimes adults just need space to think about things. I'll see you at your math competition, I promise. Rebecca gathered her purse and jacket, her movements stiff with unresolved tension. At the door, she paused. Mom, I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, Eleanor interrupted softly. And perhaps that's something we both need to reflect on. After they left, Eleanor sat alone at her dining table, surrounded by half-eaten cobbler and the wreckage of what had once been a cherished family tradition. The wildflowers in the centerpiece suddenly seemed wilted and sad, their brave faces drooping under the weight of the afternoon's revelations. Contributing nothing, she repeated. To herself, testing the shape of the words that had shattered something fundamental between mother and daughter. The house felt cavernous in its silence. For the first time, Eleanor could understand why some people found solitude crushing rather than peaceful. She began clearing the table mechanically, scraping uneaten food into the compost bin, stacking dishes by the sink with the precision that had characterized her professional life. As she worked, her mind kept returning to Rebecca's accusation. Had she really contributed nothing of value? Had her lifetime of financial caution and measured advice been worthless? Was her experience truly irrelevant in a world that seemed increasingly focused on leveraging debt and chasing luxury? Eleanor washed each dish by hand, ignoring the dishwasher Rebecca had insisted on installing 3 years ago. The repetitive motion was soothing, giving her hands something to do while her thoughts churned. By the time the kitchen was spotless again, the sun had shifted, casting different patterns across the worn linoleum floor. She made herself a cup of tea and carried it to the small office off the living room. Unlike the rest of the house, which remained largely as it had been during Thomas's lifetime, this space had evolved. A computer sat on the desk, not the newest model, but perfectly adequate for Eleanor's needs. Filing cabinets lined one wall, containing decades of meticulously kept records. Eleanor set her tea down and opened the bottom drawer of her desk, removing a leather portfolio that she hadn't examined in several years. Inside were financial statements, investment records, and stock certificates, the tangible evidence of a lifetime of careful stewardship. Contrary to Craig's dismissive assessment of her financial acumen, Eleanor had indeed invested, prudently, consistently, and with the patience that comes from understanding that true wealth accumulates slowly. The stocks she'd purchased in the 1980s and 1990s had grown steadily. The municipal bonds had provided reliable income. The diverse portfolio she'd constructed had weathered market downturns that had devastated more aggressive investors. Eleanor spread the documents across her desk, confronting the reality of her financial situation for the first time in years. The truth was both gratifying and troubling. She had accumulated significant wealth, not ostentatious riches, but substantial security. Security she had always assumed would someday benefit Rebecca and her children. But now, staring at the evidence of decades of disciplined saving and investing, Eleanor was forced to confront an uncomfortable question: would passing this wealth to Rebecca and Craig simply enable the very behavior she found so troubling? Would it reinforce their dismissal of her values and experience? The telephone's ring startled her from her contemplation. Eleanor let it go to the answering machine, not ready to speak to anyone just yet. Rebecca's voice filled the room. Mom, I'm sorry about what happened at lunch. I was stressed about the bank situation, and I took it out on you. Call me back when you can. The apology sounded perfunctory, lacking genuine recognition of how deeply her words had cut. Eleanor made no move toward the phone, instead returning her attention to the financial records spread before her. As darkness fell outside her window, Eleanor McKinnon made a decision that would have shocked the woman she'd been that morning. She would not call Rebecca back immediately. She would not rush to smooth over this breach with reassurances and forgiveness. Instead, she would take time to reevaluate everything: her relationship with her daughter, her financial plans, and, most importantly, her own worth in a world that seemed increasingly determined to tell her she had nothing left to contribute. The wildflowers on the dining room table might be wilting, but Eleanor herself was not ready to fade away just yet. Perhaps it was time to show her daughter and son-in-law exactly what the financial wisdom of a previous generation could still accomplish in today's world. And perhaps it was time to demonstrate that contribution could take many forms, some of which couldn't be measured in dollars and cents at all. Eleanor closed the portfolio with a decisive snap. Tomorrow would be soon enough to begin making concrete plans. Tonight, she would allow herself to feel the pain of her daughter's dismissal, to acknowledge the hurt rather than hiding from it. Because facing reality, financial and emotional, had always been the first step in Eleanor McKinnon's approach to solving any problem. Outside, the South Dakota wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the farmhouse that had sheltered her through every storm life had thrown her way. This new tempest, though it came from an unexpected direction, would be weathered like all the others, with quiet dignity, unshakable resolve, and the kind of practical wisdom that never truly goes out of style, no matter what the market might say. Transformation. 3 days after Rebecca's devastating pronouncement, Eleanor McKinnon still hadn't left her farmhouse. The curtains remained drawn, the answering machine blinked with 7 unanswered messages, and the usually impeccable kitchen showed signs of neglect. Her blue flannel robe had become a second skin, its soft folds bearing witness to meals barely touched and tears hastily wiped away. The words, contributing nothing, followed her from room to room, an unwelcome shadow that darkened even the most familiar corners of her home. The knock that finally broke through her isolation came on Wednesday morning, 3 sharp raps that carried no patience for self-pity. Eleanor ignored it, sinking deeper into her reading chair and pulling a quilt over her lap despite the spring warmth. The knocking persisted, growing more insistent with each passing minute. Eleanor Marie McKinnon. I know you're in there, and if you don't open this door in the next 30 seconds, I'm using the spare key you gave me for emergencies. The voice belonged to Harriet Jenkins, Eleanor's next-door neighbor for over 30 years and the closest thing to a sister she'd ever had. At 73, Harriet possessed the kind of forceful energy that made people half her age step aside when she walked down Main Street. Eleanor considered pretending she wasn't home, but the threat wasn't idle. Harriet had never hesitated to take matters into her own hands when she deemed it necessary. With a sigh, Eleanor pushed herself up from the chair, wincing at the stiffness in her joints that had worsened during her days of inactivity. I'm coming, she called, her voice sounding strange to her own ears after days of silence. When she opened the door, Harriet stood on the porch with a casserole dish in one hand and a determined expression that suggested she'd come prepared for battle. Her silver hair was styled in its usual practical bob, and her keen eyes missed nothing as they assessed Eleanor's disheveled appearance. Well, Harriet said, brushing past Eleanor into the house, at least you're still alive. Though from the looks of things, you're not putting much effort into it. Eleanor closed the door, suddenly self-conscious about her unwashed hair and the robe she'd been wearing since Sunday evening. I'm fine, Harriet. Just taking some quiet time. Quiet time? Harriet set the casserole on the kitchen counter and turned to face her friend. Eleanor, you've missed the library board meeting, you didn't show up for coffee at Ruth's yesterday, and you haven't collected your mail in 3 days. That's not quiet time, that's a hibernation. The observation was accurate enough to sting. Eleanor had indeed missed obligations she would normally have considered sacrosanct. The realization that she'd let people down, people who weren't her ungrateful daughter, added a fresh layer of shame to her already complex emotions. I've had a difficult few days, she admitted, running a hand through her tangled hair. Harriet's expression softened slightly. I gathered as much when Rebecca called me yesterday, asking if I'd checked on you. Rebecca called you? Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. She did. Said you weren't answering your phone and she was worried. Harriet paused, studying Eleanor's face. She also said there might have been some harsh words exchanged during Saturday's lunch. What she didn't say was that those harsh words came from her. Eleanor sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted by the prospect of explaining. How did you know? Because I've known Rebecca since she was in pigtails, and that girl has her father's temper and her mother's pride, a dangerous combination. Harriet moved efficiently around the kitchen, putting on the kettle and retrieving mugs from the cabinet. Now, you're going to drink some tea, eat some of my chicken casserole, and tell me exactly what happened. The simple act of watching Harriet navigate her kitchen with familiar ease brought Eleanor a comfort she hadn't expected. Here was someone who knew her, really knew her, and wasn't assessing her worth based on modern financial metrics or her adherence to current trends. While the tea steeped, Eleanor recounted Saturday's lunch in halting sentences, each word drawing forth the pain she'd been trying to contain. Harriet listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. Contributing nothing, Harriet repeated when Eleanor finished. Those exact words? Eleanor nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug as if it could somehow heal the chill that had settled in her chest. Well, Harriet said after a moment, that's about the most ungrateful, short-sighted thing I've ever heard. And I've served on the town council with Stanley Wilson for 15 years, so I know short-sighted when I hear it. Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small smile tugging at her lips. Stanley's infamous opposition to the town's digital archiving system, paper was good enough for the founding fathers, had become legendary in Deadwood civic circles. She's not entirely wrong, Eleanor said quietly. The world has changed. Financial systems are different now. Maybe my experience isn't relevant anymore. Harriet fixed her with a stern look. Eleanor McKinnon, stop that nonsense right now. Do you think human nature has changed? Do you think greed, fear, and irrational exuberance aren't still driving markets just like they were when we were young? The tools change, but the fundamentals don't. Craig seems to think, Harriet interrupted, is leveraged to his eyeballs in a luxury resort development during an economic downturn, while simultaneously buying designer clothes and taking spa vacations. I wouldn't be taking financial advice from Craig if he was the last accountant on earth. Put that way, it did seem absurd. Eleanor took a sip of tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. I just never expected Rebecca to speak to me that way. To dismiss everything I've done, everything I've built. People lash out when they're afraid, Harriet observed. And from what little Rebecca told me, they're in trouble with that resort project. The bank's getting nervous. They should be, Eleanor said, her professional instincts briefly overriding her personal hurt. Luxury vacation properties are always the first to suffer in an economic contraction. If they're already having cash flow problems before completion, that's a serious red flag. Harriet smiled. See? That right there, that analysis, is exactly what Rebecca and Craig are missing. Experience. Perspective. The ability to see patterns because you've lived through them before. The validation felt like rain on parched soil. For days, Eleanor had been replaying Rebecca's cruel dismissal, allowing it to erode decades of confidence in her own abilities. Harriet's matter-of-fact reminder of her value was the first counter-narrative she'd permitted herself to consider. Now, Harriet said, standing and putting her hands on her hips, you're going to eat some casserole while I run you a bath. Then, you're going to get dressed in real clothes and rejoin the living. Because the Eleanor McKinnon I know doesn't hide away when people underestimate her. She proves them wrong. The simple directive gave Eleanor something to focus on beyond her pain. While she ate, discovering an appetite she thought had abandoned her, Harriet moved through the house with purposeful energy, opening curtains, collecting dishes, and generally restoring order to the chaos that 3 days of neglect had created. By the time Eleanor emerged from the bathroom, clean and dressed in a simple pair of slacks and a sweater, she felt more like herself than she had in days. Harriet was waiting in the living room, a stack of mail organized on the coffee table, and a determined expression on her face. There's a meeting at the community center this afternoon, she announced without preamble. The Small Business Association is discussing the impact of that new big box store opening in Rapid City. They need someone who understands how local businesses can survive when corporate competition moves in. Eleanor hesitated. Harriet, I don't know if I'm ready to. You've advised half the businesses in this town at one point or another. Harriet interrupted. Most of them are still standing because of your counsel. If that's contributing nothing, then this town needs a lot more nothing and a lot less something. The observation was so perfectly aligned with Eleanor's own suppressed thoughts that she couldn't help but laugh, a rusty sound, but genuine. You're not going to let me wallow, are you? Not for another minute, Harriet confirmed. Now get your purse. Ruth is picking us up in 15 minutes, and you know how she feels about tardiness. As they waited for Ruth, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small office where she'd examined her financial portfolio 3 nights ago. The leather binder still sat on her desk, a tangible reminder of decades of careful stewardship. You know, she said to Harriet, gesturing toward the documents, Rebecca and Craig have no idea about any of this. They assume I'm getting by on Social Security and a modest pension. Harriet raised an eyebrow. How modest are we talking about? Eleanor opened the portfolio and pointed to the bottom line on her most recent statement. Harriet's eyes widened appreciably. Good Lord, Eleanor. That's not modest, that's substantial. How on earth did you manage that on an accountant's salary while raising 2 kids alone? Small, consistent investments over 40 years, Eleanor explained. I never touched my retirement accounts, even during the lean years. I reinvested. All dividends. And I made some very fortunate stock selections in companies I believed would grow over the long term. Like that tech company the kids were always playing games on? Eleanor nodded. Among others. I bought it when Rebecca was in high school and everyone said I was crazy to invest in a company that just made entertainment. But I saw how much time young people spent with their products, and I thought, that's the future. Harriet shook her head in admiration. And Rebecca has the nerve to say you contribute nothing. Does she have any idea what you could teach them? If they'd listen? Apparently, my methods are too old-fashioned to be relevant, Eleanor said, but the bitterness that had accompanied the thought days ago had faded, replaced by a growing sense of her own worth independent of her daughter's assessment. Ruth's ancient Buick appeared in the driveway, its horn offering an impatient toot. As they headed for the door, Harriet paused. "Eleanor, you know what you should do with that portfolio?" "What's that?" "Whatever you want. It's your money, earned through your wisdom. Not Rebecca's inheritance, not a safety net for Craig's risky ventures. Yours." The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Eleanor had always seen her financial resources as a family legacy, something to be preserved for the next generation. The idea of using it for her own purposes felt almost transgressive. "I'll think about it," she promised as they stepped outside into the spring sunshine. The community center was busier than Eleanor had expected, filled with local business owners whose faces showed varying degrees of concern about the proposed big-box development. Many greeted her with genuine warmth and visible relief at her presence. "Eleanor, thank goodness," said Martin Green, who owned the hardware store his grandfather had founded. "We need someone who remembers how we survived when that chain store opened in '92. And the outlet mall in '03, added Sofia Rodriguez, whose family restaurant had weathered multiple economic challenges over 3 decades. As Eleanor took a seat, she realized that far from being irrelevant, her experience was actively sought by people who valued institutional memory and practical wisdom. For the next 2 hours, she listened to concerns, offered suggestions based on historical patterns she'd observed, and helped craft practical strategies that small businesses could implement immediately. "The key," she explained to the group, "is not to compete directly on price. That's a losing battle against corporations with massive purchasing power. Instead, focus on what they can't offer: personalized service, community connection, and deep product knowledge." Heads nodded around the room. These weren't revolutionary insights, but they were grounded in proven principles that transcended economic trends and technological changes. By the meeting's end, Eleanor had volunteered to create a series of workshops for local business owners, drawing on her decades of experience helping enterprises navigate competitive threats. "See?" Harriet said as they left the meeting. "Contributing. Nothing, my foot. You've given those people something no MBA program could provide: real-world wisdom from someone who's seen it all before." The validation from the community continued over the following weeks. Eleanor emerged from her brief period of isolation with a renewed sense of purpose, channeling her hurt into productive action rather than withdrawal. The business workshops quickly expanded to include financial literacy classes for young adults and retirement planning seminars for middle-aged residents concerned about economic instability. Each session reinforced what Harriet had tried to tell her: that her knowledge remained valuable, that her experience offered perspective unavailable in textbooks or trending financial blogs, that her contribution to the community couldn't be measured in modern metrics but was nonetheless substantial and appreciated. Parallel to her renewed community involvement, Eleanor began making subtle but significant changes to her personal life. The first was her appearance. After decades of practical but uninspired haircuts at Clara's Clippers, she made an appointment at the new salon in Rapid City that Ruth had been raving about. "I want something different," she told the young stylist, a woman with creative flair and kind eyes. "Something that looks like I chose it, not just accepted it." The resulting bob was sophisticated and flattering, with subtle layers that brought out natural waves Eleanor hadn't realized her hair still possessed. The stylist had also suggested a warmer color to soften the silver, enhancing Eleanor's complexion and drawing attention to her clear blue eyes. "You look 10 years younger," Ruth declared when Eleanor debuted her new look at their weekly coffee gathering. "And about twice as confident." The hair was just the beginning. With Harriet's encouraging but brutally honest input, Eleanor began refreshing her wardrobe, selecting pieces that reflected her personality rather than merely covering her body. She discovered a preference for jewel tones that she'd never indulged, and an affinity for well-tailored blazers that lent her small frame an air of authority. "I never realized how much I was dressing to be invisible," she confessed to Harriet during a shopping expedition to Rapid City. "As if calling attention to myself would be somehow inappropriate at my age. Society expects women our age to fade into the background," Harriet replied, holding up a vibrant teal blouse against Eleanor's newly stylish hair. "Which is exactly why we shouldn't." The external changes reflected something deeper taking root inside Eleanor: a reclamation of her own worth independent of her role as mother, grandmother, or community advisor. For perhaps the first time since Thomas's death, she began asking herself what she wanted, what would bring her joy, what dreams she had deferred in service to others' needs and expectations. The answers surprised her. Despite living in South Dakota her entire life, Eleanor had never seen the ocean. She had never visited the great financial centers of New York or London, whose markets she had followed from afar throughout her career. She had never taken a class purely for pleasure rather than professional advancement. So many nevers, she murmured one evening, making a list in the leather-bound journal Harriet had given her with the inscription, "For the next chapter." The phone calls from Rebecca continued, increasing in frequency as Eleanor's responses remained polite but brief. Her daughter's tone evolved from perfunctory apology to confusion to barely disguised frustration as weeks passed without the immediate forgiveness and return to normal that Eleanor had always previously offered. "Mom, it's been almost a month," Rebecca said during their most recent conversation. "Don't you think it's time we moved past this? We miss our Sunday lunches." "I'm not sure what there is to move past," Eleanor replied calmly. "You made your assessment of my contributions quite clear. I'm simply adjusting my life accordingly." "That's not fair. I said one thing in a moment of stress, one thing that you've been thinking for quite some time," Eleanor finished for her. "Rebecca, I'm not angry anymore. But I am taking time to re-evaluate some things, including how I want to spend my remaining years." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Rebecca had never heard this tone from her mother before, not resentful or bitter, but firmly resolved. "Sophie's math competition is next weekend," Rebecca finally said. "She's been asking if you're still coming." "Of course I am. I promised her I would be there." After hanging up, Eleanor returned to her journal, adding another item to her growing list of possibilities. The changes she was contemplating weren't born from spite or a desire to punish Rebecca. They emerged from a genuine reassessment of how she wanted to live and what legacy she truly wished to leave behind. 2 months after that devastating Sunday lunch, Eleanor McKinnon sat in her office, facing her financial advisor with a clarity of purpose that had been developing slowly but inexorably. "You want to do what?" James Foster, who had managed her investments for 15 years, looked at her over his reading glasses with undisguised surprise. "I want to liquidate approximately 30% of my portfolio," Eleanor repeated calmly. "Not all at once, of course. I understand the tax implications. But over the next 6 months." James leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound interest. "Eleanor, you've been the most conservative client in my practice for as long as I've known you. May I ask what's prompted this change?" Eleanor smiled, a confident expression that reflected her internal transformation. "Let's just say I've realized that some investments aren't meant to be passed down. They're meant to be used for growth, personal growth, in this case." "I see." James made a note on his legal pad. "And the remaining 70%? Should be restructured with greater emphasis on generating current income rather than long-term growth," Eleanor explained. "I'll still leave a meaningful legacy for my grandchildren, in trust, with clear conditions about age and purpose, but the bulk of what I've built is going to fund the next phase of my life." As James began outlining the technical aspects of her new financial strategy, Eleanor felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The burden of preserving every dollar for a future generation that might not appreciate or understand its value had been replaced by the exhilarating prospect of living deliberately, of using her resources to expand her horizons rather than contract them. The first step would be the ocean. She'd already booked a small cottage on the Oregon coast for a month-long stay in the autumn, when the summer crowds would have dispersed but the weather would still permit long walks along the shoreline. After that, perhaps New York, to see the stock exchange whose fluctuations had shaped so much of her professional life. And then, if courage didn't fail her, maybe London or even Singapore, global financial hubs she'd only read about in economic journals. Between these adventures, she would return to Deadwood, to the workshops and classes that gave her purpose, to the friends who had shown her what true appreciation looked like, and yes, to the family relationships she still valued despite their complications. But she would return as a woman transformed, not Eleanor the reliable grandmother, always available and infinitely accommodating, but Eleanor the individual, with her own dreams, boundaries, and sense of self-worth. "I think we can make this work quite effectively," James said, finishing his preliminary analysis. "You've built an impressive nest egg, Eleanor. It should easily support this new direction while still providing for your long-term security." "Thank you, James." Eleanor gathered her purse and the notes she'd made during their meeting. "I appreciate your flexibility in adjusting to my changing goals." "That's my job," he replied with a smile. "Although I must say, this new Eleanor is going to be significantly more interesting to work with." As she drove home from the financial advisor's office, Eleanor reflected on the journey of the past 2 months. The pain of Rebecca's dismissal hadn't disappeared entirely, such wounds never heal without leaving scars, but it had catalyzed a transformation that might otherwise have taken years, if it had happened at all. "Contributing nothing," she murmured, the words that had once cut so deeply now serving as a reminder of how thoroughly her daughter had misunderstood her value. Eleanor McKinnon was contributing plenty, to her community, to the next generation. of business owners, and now, finally, to her own long-deferred dreams. The farmhouse came into view as she rounded the final bend in the road. Its familiar silhouette against the South Dakota sky represented not the endpoint of her journey, but rather its launch pad, the stable foundation from which she could now explore worlds previously unimagined. Eleanor parked in the driveway and paused to admire the wildflowers blooming along the path to her front door. Like her, they had weathered harsh conditions and emerged stronger, more vibrant, and absolutely determined to flourish in their own distinct way. The parallel made her smile as she gathered her things and headed inside, ready to continue planning the remarkable next chapter of her supposedly irrelevant life. "Grandma, you came." Sophie's voice cut through the pre-competition chaos as she bounded up the bleacher steps, her team uniform crisp and her eyes bright with excitement. "Of course I did, sweetheart." Eleanor embraced her granddaughter, noting how much taller she seemed after just a few months. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Sophie beamed, then glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Mom and Dad are getting seats on the other side. They didn't think you'd want to sit with them." The observation stung, but Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "That's fine. I'm here for you, not them." "They're fighting a lot," Sophie confided, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About money and the resort project. Dad's on the phone. All the time with people who sound angry." Eleanor squeezed Sophie's hand. "Focus on your competition right now. Family stuff can wait." "But Grandma," Sophie hesitated, clearly wrestling with something beyond her years. "Last night I heard Dad tell Mom they might have to sell our house if they can't find new investors this month." The revelation sent a chill through Eleanor. Despite her ongoing frustration with Rebecca and Craig, the thought of her grandchildren facing housing insecurity awakened her protective instincts. Before she could formulate a response, however, Sophie was called back to her team. "Wish me luck. I might get the lightning round." "Good luck, sweetheart. I'll be cheering for you." As Sophie hurried away, Eleanor noticed Rebecca and Craig entering the gymnasium. Even from a distance, the strain between them was evident. Rebecca's normally perfect appearance showed subtle signs of neglect, hair not quite as polished, clothes slightly mismatched. Craig moved with the tense energy of someone under extreme pressure, checking his phone every few seconds. Eleanor deliberately turned her attention to the competition, focusing on Sophie's remarkable mathematical abilities rather than her parents' escalating problems. Her granddaughter performed brilliantly, advancing through the preliminary rounds with confident precision. When Sophie was selected for the coveted lightning round, Eleanor felt a surge of pride so intense it momentarily eclipsed all family discord. "The final question, worth 20 points, announced the moderator, is a complex compound interest problem." Eleanor leaned forward. Compound interest had been her specialty during her accounting career, the mathematical principle that had built her own financial security through patient accumulation rather than risky ventures. Sophie solved the problem with 10 seconds to spare, securing first place for her team and earning a standing ovation from the crowd. Eleanor's cheeks hurt from smiling as she watched her granddaughter accept the trophy, scanning the bleachers until she found her grandmother and offering a small, private wave of triumph. After the awards ceremony, Eleanor navigated through the dispersing crowd, intent on congratulating Sophie personally. She spotted her granddaughter near the exit, caught between her parents who appeared to be in the middle of a tense exchange. "We can't just leave," Rebecca was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "This is Sophie's moment." "Henderson just texted," Craig replied, already moving toward the door. "He's willing to meet this afternoon. This could be our last chance to salvage the project. But Sophie will understand that keeping a roof over her head is the priority right now." Sophie stood motionless between them, her trophy clutched against her chest, the joy of her victory rapidly fading from her young face. Eleanor approached the group, determined to salvage her granddaughter's achievement. "Sophie, sweetheart, that was absolutely brilliant. The way you handled that compound interest problem, you have a real gift for mathematics." Sophie's expression brightened. "Did you see the lightning round, Grandma? I wasn't even nervous." "I saw every second," Eleanor assured her. "Your grandfather would have been so proud. He always said a person who understands compound interest has the key to financial wisdom." Craig's head snapped up at this, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Eleanor. "Financial wisdom," he repeated, the words carrying an unmistakable edge. "Like the wisdom that's kept you in that outdated farmhouse while the rest of the world moved forward?" "Craig," Rebecca warned, glancing anxiously at Sophie. But Craig was already building momentum, weeks of financial pressure finding release in this unexpected target. "You know what, Eleanor? It's easy to talk about financial wisdom when you've never taken a real risk in your life. Some of us are trying to build something significant, something that will actually leave a legacy." Eleanor maintained her composure. acutely aware of Sophie's wide eyes darting between the adults. This isn't the time or place for this discussion. Today is about Sophie's achievement. Everything's always about timing with you, isn't it? Craig continued, his voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby families. Wait for the right market conditions. Don't overextend. Small, safe steps. Well, that approach might work for a small-town accountant, but the real world rewards vision and courage. The real world, Eleanor replied evenly, also punishes reckless speculation and over-leveraging, particularly in luxury markets during economic downturns. But you're right, this isn't the time for that conversation. Craig's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. He checked the message, his expression shifting from confrontational to anxious in an instant. We need to go, he said to Rebecca. Henderson's bringing his financial team. This is serious. Rebecca hesitated, torn between her husband's urgency and her daughter's special day. Sophie, honey, we need to go, Sophie said quietly. Her earlier exuberance completely extinguished. It's fine. I understand. I can take Sophie for ice cream to celebrate, Eleanor offered. If that's all right with everyone. Rebecca looked at her mother with a complicated mixture of gratitude and resentment. That would be helpful. Thank you. We'll pick her up at your house in a couple of hours, Craig added, already moving toward the exit. Don't fill her head with outdated financial theories while we're gone. After they left, Sophie stood silently beside Eleanor, the trophy now hanging limply at her side. They didn't even say congratulations, she said finally, her voice small. Sometimes adults get so caught up in their own problems that they forget what really matters, Eleanor replied, putting an arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. It doesn't mean they're not proud of you. Are they going to lose our house, Grandma? The direct question caught Eleanor off guard. What makes you ask that? I heard Dad on the phone last night. He said something about foreclosure proceedings. And personal guarantees. I looked up what those mean. Eleanor silently cursed the financial jargon that had found its way into her granddaughter's vocabulary at such a young age. Adult financial problems are complicated, Sophie. But no matter what happens with your parents' business or your house, you'll always have people who love you and will make sure you're okay. Sophie considered this, her analytical mind visibly processing the reassurance for reliability. Would you let us live with you? If we had to? The question pierced straight to Eleanor's heart. Of course I would. My home will always be open to you, no matter what. This seemed to satisfy Sophie, who finally managed a small smile. Can we still get ice cream? Absolutely. Victories should always be celebrated, especially mathematical ones. Over ice cream sundaes at Deadwood's oldest diner, Eleanor steered the conversation away from financial worries and back to Sophie's achievement. By the time they arrived at the farmhouse, the young girl had recovered much of her earlier enthusiasm, eagerly describing the mental tricks she'd used to solve the lightning round problem. It's like you taught me, Grandma, break the complex parts into smaller pieces, solve each one step by step, then put them back together. That's right, Eleanor nodded, recognizing the principle she'd applied throughout her career. That works for most problems, not just mathematical ones. They were reviewing Sophie's competition notes at the kitchen table when a car door slammed in the driveway with enough force to rattle the windows. Heavy footsteps pounded up the porch steps, followed by the front door flying open without a knock. Craig stood in the doorway, his expensive suit rumpled and his face a mask of barely controlled panic. We need to go, Sophie. Now. Eleanor rose from her chair, instinctively placing herself between Craig and her granddaughter. What's happened? Where's Rebecca? She's at home, making calls. Craig's voice was clipped, his eyes darting around the kitchen as if seeking escape routes. The meeting with Henderson didn't go well. Didn't go well how? Eleanor pressed, noting the way Sophie had shrunk in her chair, the mathematics trophy forgotten beside her notebook. Craig ran a hand through his hair, further disheveling his carefully maintained appearance. They're pulling out completely. Called the loan. We have 30 days to find alternative financing or they start foreclosure proceedings on the project and our personal assets. The severity of the situation was immediately clear to Eleanor. Craig and Rebecca had evidently offered personal guarantees for the business loans, a risky move that had now placed their home and other assets in jeopardy. Dad? Sophie's voice was barely audible. Are we going to lose our house? Craig seemed to notice his daughter's presence for the first time, his expression shifting from panic to forced reassurance. No, honey, of course not. It's just a temporary setback. Your mom and I will figure something out. The platitude rang hollow even to Eleanor's ears. Sophie, with her mathematician's precision, clearly recognized the lie as well, but nodded dutifully. Get your things, Sophie, Craig said, making a visible effort to soften his tone. Mom's waiting for us. As Sophie gathered her belongings, Craig pulled Eleanor aside, his earlier hostility replaced by desperate intensity. This isn't just a cash flow problem anymore. It's existential. If we can't find new investors immediately, we lose everything: the house, the cars, Sophie's college fund. Everything. Eleanor studied her son-in-law's face, seeing beyond the panic to the genuine fear beneath. For all his arrogance and dismissiveness, Craig was terrified of failing his family. It was, perhaps, the most human she'd ever seen him. How much would it take to stabilize the situation, she asked quietly. Craig named a figure that would have made Eleanor flinch just a few months ago. Now, with her revised financial strategy and new perspective on legacy, she simply nodded thoughtfully. I might be able to help, she said carefully. Not with the full amount, but enough to create breathing room while you restructure the project. Hope flashed across Craig's face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Why would you do that? After everything that's been said? Not for you, Eleanor replied honestly. And not for Rebecca, at least not primarily. For Sophie and Jason. They deserve stability. Before Craig could respond, Sophie returned with her backpack and trophy. I'm ready, Dad. We'll talk more about this later, Eleanor said to Craig, then turned to embrace her granddaughter. I'm so proud of you, Sophie. Never forget that. After they left, Eleanor remained at her kitchen table, contemplating the unexpected turn of events. Her financial advisor's words echoed in her mind. You've built an impressive nest egg, Eleanor. It should easily support this new direction, while still providing for your long-term security. The question was no longer whether she could help Rebecca and Craig, but whether she should, and if so, under what conditions. Would providing financial assistance merely enable the very behavior and attitudes that had led to this crisis? Or could it be structured as a teaching moment, a way to demonstrate the value of the financial wisdom they had so casually dismissed? Eleanor was still pondering these questions the next morning when Harriet arrived for their usual Saturday coffee. She listened intently as Eleanor described the situation, her expression growing increasingly troubled. So Craig actually asked for your help? Harriet said when Eleanor finished. The same man who dismissed your financial experience as irrelevant? He didn't ask directly, Eleanor clarified. But he didn't refuse when I offered. Of course. He didn't. Drowning men don't refuse life preservers, even from people they've insulted. Harriet stirred her coffee with uncharacteristic agitation. The question is whether throwing him this particular life preserver helps him learn to swim or just encourages more reckless behavior. That's exactly what I've been considering, Eleanor admitted. If I do nothing, Sophie and Jason suffer. For their parents' mistakes. If I help unconditionally, Craig and Rebecca learn that there are no consequences for their choices or their treatment of others. So don't help unconditionally, Harriet suggested. You're a businesswoman, Eleanor. Approach this like a business transaction with clear terms and expectation. The idea resonated with Eleanor. Throughout her career, she had structured countless financial arrangements that balanced assistance with accountability. Perhaps this situation called for the same approach, not emotional blackmail or petty revenge, but a clear-eyed assessment of risk and return, with appropriate safeguards built in. I need to think about what conditions would actually make a difference, Eleanor mused. Not just financially, but in terms of family dynamics and mutual respect. Whatever you decide, Harriet said, reaching across the table to squeeze her friend's hand, remember that you're negotiating from a position of strength now, not supplication. You're not asking for a place in their lives anymore. They're asking for your help. The shift in perspective felt significant. For months, Eleanor had been rebuilding her sense of self-worth independent of her daughter's validation. Now, that internal work would be tested against external pressures and emotional appeals. She was still contemplating potential approaches when her phone rang late that afternoon. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen, the first direct call from her daughter in weeks. Mom? Rebecca's voice carried a vulnerability Eleanor hadn't heard since her daughter was a teenager facing her first heartbreak. Can we talk? In person? Of course, Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral despite the immediate concern that flooded her. Would you like to come to the farmhouse? Please. Just me, not Craig. Is that okay? Whenever you're ready, dear. Rebecca arrived 45 minutes later, her car pulling into the driveway with uncharacteristic hesitancy. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor watched her daughter sit motionless behind the wheel for several long moments before finally emerging. Her normally impeccable appearance had deteriorated further since the mathematics competition, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, clothes wrinkled as if slept in, eyes shadowed by evident exhaustion. Eleanor met her at the door with quiet composure, neither rushing to embrace her nor holding her at arm's length. "Come in. I've made fresh coffee." Rebecca stepped inside, her gaze traveling around the familiar kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last. "The house looks different somehow." "I've made some changes," Eleanor acknowledged, pouring coffee into mugs painted by Sophie years ago for Mother's Day. "New curtains, some different furniture arrangements. Small things. It suits you," Rebecca said, accepting the coffee with visibly trembling hands. "It feels more intentional." They settled at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface where so many family discussions had unfolded over the decades. For several minutes, neither spoke, the silence filled with the weight of unresolved hurt and approaching crisis. "Craig said you offered to help," Rebecca finally said, her eyes fixed on her coffee rather than her mother's face. "After everything we said to you." "Everything I said. I offered to consider helping," Eleanor corrected gently. "For Sophie and Jason's sake primarily." Rebecca flinched slightly at the qualification but nodded. "That's fair. More than fair, actually." Another silence stretched between them, this one more expectant. "How bad is it really, Rebecca?" Eleanor finally asked. "The complete truth, not the sanitized version." Rebecca's composure cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "It's worse than bad, Mom. It's catastrophic. We're 30 days from losing everything, the house, the cars, even our personal savings. The resort project is collapsing, and because Craig personally guaranteed the loans." "You're personally liable," Eleanor finished for her. "I suspected as much." "Craig thought it showed confidence in the project," Rebecca explained, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "The bank required it for the size of loan we needed. And now Henderson Investment Group is calling the loan because the economic forecast has worsened. Luxury vacation properties are seen as high risk in the current climate." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "Exactly what you would have told us if we'd asked." The admission hung in the air between them, a tacit acknowledgement of Eleanor's financial wisdom that had come far too late to prevent disaster. "Sophie mentioned you might lose the house," Eleanor said carefully. "How much does she understand about what's happening?" "Too much," Rebecca admitted. "She's been eavesdropping on our arguments. Jason too, though he pretends not to care. They're both scared, Mom. They've never faced any real financial insecurity before. Unlike you," Eleanor thought but didn't say. Rebecca had grown up during the lean years after Thomas died, when Eleanor had worked extra accounting jobs in the evenings and weekends to keep the family afloat. Her daughter had witnessed firsthand the value of financial prudence during difficult times, which made her current situation all the more tragic. "What are you asking of me, exactly?" Eleanor asked, bringing the conversation back to its central purpose. Rebecca took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into cold water. "We need $325,000 to satisfy the immediate requirements of the Henderson loan and keep the project viable while we find new investors. Without it, foreclosure proceedings begin in 30 days. The figure was substantial, not Eleanor's entire nest egg, but a significant portion of the funds she had earmarked for her own future plans. She kept her expression neutral, revealing neither shock nor immediate rejection. "That's a considerable sum," she observed. "What collateral are you offering?" Rebecca blinked, clearly taken aback by the businesslike approach. "Collateral?" "Yes, Rebecca. If I were to consider providing that amount, I would need security for the loan, just as any financial institution would require." I hadn't thought about it that way," Rebecca admitted. "I suppose we could offer a second mortgage on the house, though its value has dropped recently." "The house is already at risk of foreclosure," Eleanor pointed out. "That's not secure collateral." "What about ownership interest in the resort project itself?" Rebecca's expression shifted from surprised to alarmed. "You want to become a partner in the business? But you've always been so conservative financially. This project is exactly the kind of speculative investment you warned against." "I'm not saying I want to," Eleanor clarified. "I'm exploring what options might exist if I were to consider helping. There's a difference between making a speculative investment by choice, with eyes open to the risks, and having no choice because family members are in crisis." The distinction clearly hadn't occurred to Rebecca, who struggled visibly with this new perspective on her mother's financial thinking. "I'll need to discuss this with Craig. He's particular about control of the business." "I'm sure he is," Eleanor said dryly. "And I'm particular about where my money goes and under what conditions. If I choose to help, it won't be with a blank check and a pat on the head." Rebecca flushed. "That's not what I'm asking for, isn't it?" Eleanor's voice remained gentle, despite the directness of her words. You want me to provide funds to rescue a project I advised against from the beginning, managed by people who told me my financial wisdom was irrelevant, with no say in how the money is used or how I'm treated. Going forward. Put so plainly, the unreasonableness of the expectation was undeniable. Rebecca's shoulders slumped as the weight of her position settled fully upon her. You're right, she conceded quietly. It's not fair to ask that of you. I don't know what else to do, Mom. We're drowning. Eleanor studied her daughter, seeing beyond the designer clothes, now rumpled, and carefully cultivated sophistication, now crumbling, to the frightened young woman beneath. For all her dismissiveness of her mother's values, Rebecca had never faced true financial hardship as an adult. She had no experiential framework for navigating this level of crisis. I haven't said no, Eleanor clarified. I've said that if I help, it will be on terms that make sense for everyone involved, financially and personally. Hope flickered in Rebecca's eyes. What kind of terms? I need time to consider that carefully, Eleanor replied. This isn't just about money, Rebecca. It's about respect, values, and what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. I understand, Rebecca said, though her expression suggested she was still processing this new dynamic between them. When will you let us know? Give me 3 days, Eleanor said after a moment's consideration. I need to consult with my financial advisor and think through the implications carefully. 3 days, Rebecca echoed, visibly calculating what other options might be pursued in that timeframe and coming up empty. All right. Thank you for even considering it. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she paused at the door, turning back with an expression of genuine curiosity. Mom, can I ask you something? Where would this money come from? I always thought you were getting by on your pension and Social Security. Eleanor smiled slightly. That's because you never asked about my finances, dear. You assumed. So you have savings? Investments? I have the results of 40 years of careful financial management, Eleanor replied. Something you once dismissed as irrelevant in today's world. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca, whose face flushed with belated understanding. I was wrong about that. About a lot of things. Yes, Eleanor agreed simply. You were. After Rebecca left, Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen, watching the sunset paint the distant hills with gold and purple. The conversation had shifted something fundamental in their relationship, not healing the breach entirely, but creating the possibility of a new foundation built on mutual respect rather than obligatory attachment. The phone call to her financial advisor would wait until morning. Tonight, Eleanor needed to clarify her own priorities and principles. What conditions would make financial assistance an act of wisdom rather than enabling? What boundaries needed to be established to ensure that any help she provided created growth rather than dependency? As darkness fell over the South Dakota landscape, Eleanor McKinnon began making notes in her leather journal, outlining not just financial terms but relational expectations as well. The woman who had once been dismissed as contributing nothing was now preparing to demonstrate exactly what her contribution could be, not just in dollars and cents, but in the currency of wisdom, boundaries, and self-respect that no market downturn could devalue. Artifact ID equals South_Dakota_story_part 4 type equals text/markdown title equals part 4 resolution and redemption. The conference room at First National Bank of Deadwood had witnessed countless financial negotiations over the decades, but few as emotionally charged as the one about to begin. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, professional attire that reflected the seriousness with which she approached this meeting. Her leather portfolio contained documents prepared by her financial advisor, marked with yellow tabs indicating where signatures would be required. James Foster, her trusted financial counsel for 15 years, sat beside her reviewing final details. You're certain about these terms? He asked quietly. They're quite stringent. They need to be, Eleanor replied. This isn't just about money. It's about establishing a new foundation for our relationship. The door opened as Rebecca and Craig entered, followed by their attorney, a nervous young man clutching a legal pad who had clearly been retained in haste. Craig's appearance had deteriorated further since Eleanor had last seen him, his designer suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight, dark circles shadowing his eyes. Rebecca looked equally strained but carried herself with new resolve, meeting her mother's gaze directly rather than glancing away. Thank you for meeting us here, Eleanor said, gesturing to the chairs across the table. I thought neutral ground would be appropriate for this discussion. Craig nodded stiffly, his pride visibly at war with his desperation. We appreciate your willingness to consider helping us. Before we begin, Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm, I want to be clear about something. I'm here because I love my grandchildren and want to ensure their stability. I'm also here because, despite recent tensions, I care about you both and don't wish to see you suffer financial ruin. But this meeting will only proceed if we all acknowledge that we're establishing a new relationship dynamic, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation or condescension. Rebecca nodded immediately. That's fair, Mom. More than fair. Craig hesitated longer, his jaw working as he processed this explicit shifting of power. Finally, he too nodded. Understood. Good. Eleanor opened her portfolio and removed the first document. I've prepared a term sheet outlining the conditions under which I'm willing to provide financial assistance. I suggest we review it point by point before any decisions are made. The young attorney reached for the document, but Craig intercepted it, scanning the first page with growing disbelief. This isn't a gift, he said, looking up sharply. It's a business transaction. Yes, Eleanor confirmed simply. Did you expect something different? I thought. Craig faltered, glancing at Rebecca. Given the family connection. The family connection is precisely why this needs to be structured formally, Eleanor explained. Personal loans between family members without clear terms create resentment and dysfunction. I've seen it destroy relationships throughout my career. Rebecca gently took the document from Craig's hands, reading more carefully. 20% ownership stake in the resort project, she read aloud. Quarterly financial reviews. Family counseling? She looked up in confusion. Mom, some of these conditions aren't financial at all. No, Eleanor agreed. Because the problems we're addressing aren't solely financial. The resort project is in crisis partly because of economic conditions, yes, but also because of management approaches that rejected cautious counsel in favor of aggressive expansion. Craig bristled. If you're saying this is all my fault, I'm saying, Eleanor interrupted firmly, that poor decisions were made, both financially and interpersonally. My assistance comes with the expectation that both areas will be addressed. The attorney cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. McKinnon, with all due respect, family counseling seems outside the scope of a standard financial agreement. This isn't a standard financial agreement, Eleanor replied. It's a comprehensive approach to addressing a crisis that affects every aspect of our family's well-being. Rebecca continued reading, her expression shifting between surprise, discomfort, and reluctant recognition. Monthly family dinners at neutral locations, with respectful participation from all parties. Public acknowledgement to Sophie and Jason that financial mistakes were made, with appropriate apologies for the insecurity caused. She looked up at her mother. These are extensive conditions. They're necessary ones, Eleanor said gently. Rebecca, the damage here isn't just to your credit score or property holdings. It's to your children's sense of security, to our family relationships, to the fundamental trust that should exist between generations. Craig, who had been reading over Rebecca's shoulder, pushed the document away with evident frustration. This is humiliating. You're using our financial crisis to force us to submit to your control. No, Eleanor corrected calmly. I'm using my financial resources to create an opportunity for genuine healing and growth. There's a difference. James Foster, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, now spoke up. If I may add some context, he said, addressing Craig directly. Mrs. McKinnon approached this decision with extraordinary care. The terms before you protect everyone's interests, yours, hers, and most importantly, your children's. From a purely financial perspective, they're actually quite generous given the high-risk nature of the situation. The attorney nodded reluctantly. He's right, Mr. Hartwell. The interest rate alone is well below market for a distressed business loan. Craig's resistance visibly wavered as the reality of their limited options settled in. What about the ownership stake? I built this company from the ground up. I don't want to answer to a board or committee. You won't be, Eleanor assured him. My role would be advisory, not operational. But I do require transparency and the opportunity to offer guidance before major decisions are made. The guidance you would have given from the beginning if we'd asked, Rebecca said quietly, the admission clearly difficult but necessary. The guidance that might have prevented this situation entirely. Craig looked at his wife sharply, unused to anything but unified support from that quarter. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, something new in her expression, not defiance exactly, but a clear-eyed assessment that had been missing in their relationship. We need to discuss this privately, Craig said finally, standing abruptly. Can we have the room for a few minutes? Eleanor nodded, gathering her papers. Take whatever time you need. James and I will wait in the lobby. In the bank's elegant reception area, Eleanor settled into a leather chair, maintaining her composure despite the emotional turbulence beneath the surface. James sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. You know they have no real choice, he observed quietly. With the Henderson loan being called, your offer is their only viable option short of bankruptcy. I know, Eleanor acknowledged. But they need to come to that conclusion themselves. Especially Craig. The family counseling requirement is the sticking point, I think. It's one thing to accept financial help, another to acknowledge the need for emotional and relational assistance. Eleanor nodded, watching the bank's ornate clock tick steadily on the wall. That's precisely why it's non-negotiable. Without addressing the underlying patterns, any financial solution would be temporary at best. 20 minutes passed before the conference room door opened and Rebecca appeared, her expression resolute. "We're ready to continue the discussion," she said. "But Craig has some counter-proposals." Back in the conference room, Craig's demeanor had shifted from defensive anger to tightly controlled negotiation mode. "I've reviewed your terms," he began without preamble. "I can accept most of the financial conditions, including the ownership stake, though I'd prefer 15% rather than 20%. Eleanor had anticipated this opening gambit. 18%, with the additional 2% held in trust for Sophie and Jason's education. Craig blinked, clearly not expecting such a specific counteroffer. "That's acceptable," he conceded after a moment. "And the non-financial conditions?" Eleanor pressed, unwilling to allow selective acceptance of her terms. Craig's jaw tightened. "The family dinners and financial transparency with the children, fine. But the counseling requirement feels excessive and intrusive." Eleanor had prepared for this resistance as well. "The counseling isn't punitive, Craig. It's restorative. We've all contributed to the current dysfunction in our family dynamics. I include myself in that assessment." This acknowledgement of her own role in the family's problems visibly surprised both Rebecca and Craig. Eleanor continued, her voice softening slightly, "We have an opportunity here to build something better than what existed before, not just financially, but relationally. I'm asking you to approach that opportunity with the same courage you bring to your business ventures." Rebecca reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it gently. "She's right, Craig. We need this, all of it. Not just the money, but the chance to repair what's broken between us. All of us." The moment stretched taut with possibility. Eleanor could see Craig wrestling with his pride, his need for control, and his genuine love for his family. She waited, neither pushing nor retreating, allowing him the dignity of making this choice himself. 6 months, he said finally. "I'll commit to 6 months of counseling, with the option to reevaluate after that." 8 months, Eleanor countered, with a joint assessment at the end to determine next steps. Craig held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. "Agreed." The remainder of the meeting proceeded with surprising efficiency as they worked through the practical details of the agreement. Eleanor would provide $325,000 in exchange for an 18% stake in the resort development, with an additional 2% placed in trust for her grandchildren. Quarterly financial reviews would ensure transparency and allow for strategic adjustments. Family counseling would begin within 2 weeks and continue for a minimum of 8 months. As the attorneys finalized the paperwork, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that her grandchildren's immediate security was assured, hope that the family might heal from recent wounds, and a quiet pride in her own evolution. 6 months ago, she would have provided the money without conditions, grateful simply to be needed. Today, she negotiated from a position of strength and self-worth, offering help that addressed root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. After the final documents were signed, James Foster excused himself tactfully, leaving Eleanor alone with her daughter and son-in-law. An awkward silence descended, the formality of the legal proceedings giving way to the more complicated reality of family dynamics. "Thank you," Rebecca said finally, the simple words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. "Not just for the financial help, but for caring enough to demand better from all of us." Craig nodded, his expression more subdued than Eleanor had ever seen it. "This wasn't how I envisioned resolving our situation," he admitted. "But I'm beginning to think it may be what we needed, not just what we wanted." Eleanor smiled slightly, recognizing the significant concession these words represented from a man so driven by pride and ambition. "Sometimes the help we need isn't the help we initially seek," she observed. "I've learned that myself these past months." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca hesitated, then asked, "What made you decide to help us, Mom? After everything that was said, everything we did, you had every right to refuse." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "2 things, really. First, Sophie and Jason deserve stability and security while you and Craig rebuild. They shouldn't pay the price for adult mistakes." "And the second?" Craig asked, surprising Eleanor with his apparent interest in her reasoning. "I realize that allowing you to face financial ruin without offering the help within my power wouldn't bring healing, it would just perpetuate the cycle of hurt in a different form. She gathered her belongings, adding quietly, "True strength isn't found in withholding help to prove a point. It's found in offering help in a way that creates growth rather than dependency." The wisdom of this statement seemed to land with both Rebecca and Craig, who exchanged a glance that suggested new understanding, perhaps of Eleanor, perhaps of themselves, perhaps of the complex interplay between financial and emotional well-being that had eluded them until crisis forced a reckoning. "The first family dinner will be this Sunday," Eleanor reminded them as they parted ways outside the bank. "I've reserved a private room at the Homestead restaurant. Sophie and Jason should be prepared for an honest but age-appropriate discussion of recent events." "We'll be there," Rebecca promised. "All of us, with open minds and hearts." As Eleanor drove home, the familiar South Dakota landscape seemed to reflect her internal state, open, expansive, but with defined boundaries that created safety rather than limitation. The skies that had once seemed to press down with the weight of rejection now stretched before her with possibility, a canvas for the next chapter of her life. Harriet was waiting at the farmhouse, pacing the porch with evident concern. "Well?" she demanded as Eleanor climbed from her car. "Did they accept your terms?" "Every one," Eleanor confirmed, unable to suppress a small smile of satisfaction. "Though Craig negotiated around the edges, as I expected he would." "And you held firm?" "On the essentials, yes." Eleanor unlocked her front door, leading Harriet into the kitchen where she began preparing tea with practiced movements. The counseling requirement was the hardest for him to accept, but in the end, he recognized its necessity. Harriet settled at the table, watching her friend with evident pride. "Do you realize what you've accomplished here, Eleanor? You've transformed a painful rejection into an opportunity for growth, not just for yourself, but for your entire family." "It's too soon to know if the transformation will last," Eleanor cautioned, ever the pragmatist. "Real change takes time and consistent effort." "But the foundation has been laid," Harriet insisted. "And it's a foundation built on mutual respect and clear boundaries, not obligation or fear. That's no small achievement." As they sipped their tea, Eleanor shared her plans for the coming months, the family counseling sessions she would attend. With genuine openness to her own role in past dysfunction. The quarterly business reviews where she would offer her financial expertise without imposing control, the family dinners where new patterns of communication would be established with patience and intentionality. "And what about your own plans?" Harriet asked pointedly. "The Oregon coast? New York? All those adventures you were mapping out before this crisis erupted?" "Delayed, not abandoned," Eleanor assured her. "I've adjusted my timeline, not my destination. The coastal cottage is booked for 3 months from now, after the initial phase of family healing is underway." "Good," Harriet said firmly. "Because, while helping your family is important, so is living the life you've earned through decades of careful stewardship." Eleanor nodded, feeling the rightness of this balanced approach. Her worth wasn't defined solely by what she contributed to others, nor was it measured only by her personal achievements. The integration of both aspects, giving generously while honoring her own needs and dreams, represented true wisdom, the kind that could only be earned through lived experience. The first family dinner at the Homestead restaurant proved both challenging and healing in ways Eleanor had anticipated. Sophie and Jason arrived with visible apprehension, unused to formal family discussions about difficult topics. Rebecca and Craig presented a united front for perhaps the first time in months, having clearly prepared themselves for this important conversation. Eleanor had chosen the venue carefully, a private dining room with comfortable seating and warm lighting, a neutral space where no one held home court advantage. The staff had been instructed to serve family style, encouraging sharing and connection rather than individual focus. "Before we begin," Eleanor said once they were settled, "I want to thank you all for being here. This is the beginning of something important, a new way of being family together that honors each person's worth while acknowledging our interconnection." Craig, who had arrived looking tense and defensive, visibly relaxed at this framing. "That's well said," he acknowledged. "And I'd like to add something, if I may." At Eleanor's encouraging nod, he turned to face his children directly. "Sophie, Jason, your mother and I owe you an apology. We've been so caught up in our business problems that we've neglected what matters most, your sense of security and well-being." Jason, who had arrived with his customary air of teenage detachment, looked up from his water glass with surprise. "Are we really going to lose our house?" he asked, the question revealing that beneath his apparent indifference lay genuine concern. "No," Rebecca assured him firmly. "We're not losing the house. But we are making some significant changes to our financial situation and priorities." With remarkable candor for someone so typically concerned with appearances, Rebecca explained the basics of the family's financial restructuring, including Eleanor's role in providing assistance. She acknowledged the mistakes made, particularly the overextension into a risky development without adequate safeguards. Your grandmother, she added, with a respectful glance at Eleanor, has not only helped us financially but has reminded us of principles we should have remembered all along, principles about sustainable growth, careful planning, and valuing stability over flashy success. Sophie? Harriet smiled. See? That right there, that analysis, is exactly what Rebecca and Craig are missing. Experience. Perspective. The ability to see patterns because you've lived through them before. The validation felt like rain on parched soil. For days, Eleanor had been replaying Rebecca's cruel dismissal, allowing it to erode decades of confidence in her own abilities. Harriet's matter-of-fact reminder of her value was the first counter-narrative she'd permitted herself to consider. Now, Harriet said, standing and putting her hands on her hips, you're going to eat some casserole while I run you a bath. Then, you're going to get dressed in real clothes and rejoin the living. Because the Eleanor McKinnon I know doesn't hide away when people underestimate her. She proves them wrong. The simple directive gave Eleanor something to focus on beyond her pain. While she ate, discovering an appetite she thought had abandoned her, Harriet moved through the house with purposeful energy, opening curtains, collecting dishes, and generally restoring order to the chaos that 3 days of neglect had created. By the time Eleanor emerged from the bathroom, clean and dressed in a simple pair of slacks and a sweater, she felt more like herself than she had in days. Harriet was waiting in the living room, a stack of mail organized on the coffee table, and a determined expression on her face. There's a meeting at the community center this afternoon, she announced without preamble. The Small Business Association is discussing the impact of that new big box store opening in Rapid City. They need someone who understands how local businesses can survive when corporate competition moves in. Eleanor hesitated. Harriet, I don't know if I'm ready to. You've advised half the businesses in this town at one point or another. Harriet interrupted. Most of them are still standing because of your counsel. If that's contributing nothing, then this town needs a lot more nothing and a lot less something. The observation was so perfectly aligned with Eleanor's own suppressed thoughts that she couldn't help but laugh, a rusty sound, but genuine. You're not going to let me wallow, are you? Not for another minute, Harriet confirmed. Now get your purse. Ruth is picking us up in 15 minutes, and you know how she feels about tardiness. As they waited for Ruth, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small office where she'd examined her financial portfolio 3 nights ago. The leather binder still sat on her desk, a tangible reminder of decades of careful stewardship. You know, she said to Harriet, gesturing toward the documents, Rebecca and Craig have no idea about any of this. They assume I'm getting by on Social Security and a modest pension. Harriet raised an eyebrow. How modest are we talking about? Eleanor opened the portfolio and pointed to the bottom line on her most recent statement. Harriet's eyes widened appreciably. Good Lord, Eleanor. That's not modest, that's substantial. How on earth did you manage that on an accountant's salary while raising 2 kids alone? Small, consistent investments over 40 years, Eleanor explained. I never touched my retirement accounts, even during the lean years. I reinvested. All dividends. And I made some very fortunate stock selections in companies I believed would grow over the long term. Like that tech company the kids were always playing games on? Eleanor nodded. Among others. I bought it when Rebecca was in high school and everyone said I was crazy to invest in a company that just made entertainment. But I saw how much time young people spent with their products, and I thought, that's the future. Harriet shook her head in admiration. And Rebecca has the nerve to say you contribute nothing. Does she have any idea what you could teach them? If they'd listen? Apparently, my methods are too old-fashioned to be relevant, Eleanor said, but the bitterness that had accompanied the thought days ago had faded, replaced by a growing sense of her own worth independent of her daughter's assessment. Ruth's ancient Buick appeared in the driveway, its horn offering an impatient toot. As they headed for the door, Harriet paused. Eleanor, you know what you should do with that portfolio? What's that? Whatever you want. It's your money, earned through your wisdom. Not Rebecca's inheritance, not a safety net for Craig's risky ventures. Yours. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Eleanor had always seen her financial resources as a family legacy, something to be preserved for the next generation. The idea of using it for her own purposes felt almost transgressive. I'll think about it, she promised as they stepped outside into the spring sunshine. The community center was busier than Eleanor had expected, filled with local business owners whose faces showed varying degrees of concern about the proposed big box development. Many greeted her with genuine warmth and visible relief at her presence. Eleanor, thank goodness, said Martin Green, who owned the hardware store his grandfather had founded. We need someone who remembers how we survived when that chain store opened in '92. And the outlet mall in '03, added Sofia Rodriguez, whose family restaurant had weathered multiple economic challenges over 3 decades. As Eleanor took a seat, she realized that far from being irrelevant, her experience was actively sought by people who valued institutional memory and practical wisdom. For the next 2 hours, she listened to concerns, offered suggestions based on historical patterns she'd observed, and helped craft practical strategies that small businesses could implement immediately. The key, she explained to the group, is not to compete directly on price. That's a losing battle against corporations with massive purchasing power. Instead, focus on what they can't offer: personalized service, community connection, and deep product knowledge. Heads nodded around the room. These weren't revolutionary insights, but they were grounded in proven principles that transcended economic trends and technological changes. By the meeting's end, Eleanor had volunteered to create a series of workshops for local business owners, drawing on her decades of experience helping enterprises navigate competitive threats. "See?" Harriet said as they left the meeting. "Contributing. Nothing, my foot. You've given those people something no MBA program could provide: real-world wisdom from someone who's seen it all before." The validation from the community continued over the following weeks. Eleanor emerged from her brief period of isolation with a renewed sense of purpose, channeling her hurt into productive action rather than withdrawal. The business workshops quickly expanded to include financial literacy classes for young adults and retirement planning seminars for middle-aged residents concerned about economic instability. Each session reinforced what Harriet had tried to tell her: that her knowledge remained valuable, that her experience offered perspective unavailable in textbooks or trending financial blogs, that her contribution to the community couldn't be measured in modern metrics but was nonetheless substantial and appreciated. Parallel to her renewed community involvement, Eleanor began making subtle but significant changes to her personal life. The first was her appearance. After decades of practical but uninspired haircuts at Clara's Clippers, she made an appointment at the new salon in Rapid City that Ruth had been raving about. "I want something different," she told the young stylist, a woman with creative flair and kind eyes. "Something that looks like I chose it, not just accepted it." The resulting bob was sophisticated and flattering, with subtle layers that brought out natural waves Eleanor hadn't realized her hair still possessed. The stylist had also suggested a warmer color to soften the silver, enhancing Eleanor's complexion and drawing attention to her clear blue eyes. "You look 10 years younger," Ruth declared when Eleanor debuted her new look at their weekly coffee gathering. "And about twice as confident." The hair was just the beginning. With Harriet's encouraging but brutally honest input, Eleanor began refreshing her wardrobe, selecting pieces that reflected her personality rather than merely covering her body. She discovered a preference for jewel tones that she'd never indulged, and an affinity for well-tailored blazers that lent her small frame an air of authority. "I never realized how much I was dressing to be invisible," she confessed to Harriet during a shopping expedition to Rapid City. "As if calling attention to myself would be somehow inappropriate at my age. Society expects women our age to fade into the background," Harriet replied, holding up a vibrant teal blouse against Eleanor's newly stylish hair. "Which is exactly why we shouldn't." The external changes reflected something deeper taking root inside Eleanor, a reclamation of her own worth independent of her role as mother, grandmother, or community advisor. For perhaps the first time since Thomas's death, she began asking herself what she wanted, what would bring her joy, what dreams she had deferred in service to others' needs and expectations. The answers surprised her. Despite living in South Dakota her entire life, Eleanor had never seen the ocean. She had never visited the great financial centers of New York or London, whose markets she had followed from afar throughout her career. She had never taken a class purely for pleasure rather than professional advancement. "So many nevers," she murmured one evening, making a list in the leather-bound journal Harriet had given her with the inscription,